Have you ever sat in that heavy silence at a family dinner? Here on Tales of Home, we retell those moments, honest, everyday, sometimes controversial. Every story is a mirror. Subscribe, join the conversation, and maybe find a little healing. The morning began the way so many of my mornings do, quiet, orderly, and held together by small rituals I've repeated for years. The old townhouse off Benefit Street creaked as the radiators woke. I rinsed a bowl beneath the tap and set a rack of toast to pop, while the classical station murmured from a battered radio on the windowsill. My name is Eleanor Reed. I'm 66, a widow, and I have learned that an empty house can be kept at bay if you lace each hour with purpose. Purpose arrived in the form of plates to stack and a floor to sweep. Beyond the kitchen window, Providence still wore the last ragged lace of winter. A gull traced the river's edge. A bus hissed at the corner. Over the years, this house has been full, and then less so, and lately full again. My eldest son Michael moved back after Peter, my husband, died, bringing his wife Sabrina and their 7-year-old Theo. Michael is an architect who drafts deep into the night, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, the knuckle of his index finger bearing a faint graphite stain he never notices. Michael had already slipped out. He forgot an umbrella as usual. It leaned in the hall like a scolded guest. Theo had wolfed down half a banana, then clattered down the front steps to meet the school bus, his backpack riding high between his shoulder blades. The house exhaled in his wake. Upstairs, water began to run the steady drum of a shower through the old pipes. "Ellie, I'm rinsing off and then I'll get to the market." Sabrina called over the rush. She has lived here long enough to call me Ellie, long enough that the tiles remember the echo of her voice. I wiped a circle of condensation off the window with the dish towel and called back, "Take your time." I would like to say that Sabrina and I were made for each other, but families are not made. They are negotiated. She could be bright as a doorstep chrysanthemum on some days, and pressed as a closed book on others. She ran a tight domestic ship, labeled shelves and tidied toys into sky blue bins. When Michael's hours stretched, she stretched to meet them. They were trying, both of them, to keep adult promises in a world that always wants more. The landline rang. Ours is a stout black phone on the wall with a coiled cord that has memorized too many conversations. I dried my hands and lifted the receiver, already rehearsing the gentle voice one reserves for fundraisers, solicitors, and wrong numbers. "Mom," said a voice as cracked as sunlight on ice. "It's me." No matter how many airports Adrian passes through, my younger son always sounds a little winded, as if the sky itself had jogged him. He wanted to know how I slept, how my arthritis was behaving, whether Theo liked the red sneakers he'd sent. He was between flights at TF Green. He said a quick layover, his crew boarding soon, though his roots often lifted him far past Rhode Island. I leaned my hip into the counter and let the comfort of his chatter wash over the kitchen. "Tell Sabrina I finally tried that bakery on Wickenden," he said, his voice bright. "The almond croissants do not taste of almond, but of a dream that remembers almonds." I laughed, picturing him in a terminal chair, tie-loosened hair too long over the ears. Then something in his tone changed, pulled tight like thread caught on a nail. "Mom," he said the word smaller, "I need you to listen carefully." The radiator clicked. Upstairs, the water still ran. I switched off the radio. "What is it, darling?" This is odd. I think I saw Sabrina." I pressed the receiver closer. "You saw her where?" He lowered his voice as if someone were hovering at his elbow. "At my gate. She came through Jet Bridge security 5 minutes ago. First-class boarding. I saw her passport at the podium. The agent said her name out loud. You know how they do when they scan the chip. It was her mom. She's on my flight to Madrid." The kitchen, so full a breath earlier, somehow went thin. I found the edge of the table by memory and sat. "That can't be right," I said, because what else can a person say when a solid floor wobbles? "She's upstairs in the shower." Adrian was quiet long enough for me to hear the terminal public address scrape, and then smooth into another announcement. He must have shielded the mouthpiece, because when he spoke again, it was nearly a whisper. "I know what I saw." I turned toward the hall and the stairwell beyond it. Water carried its same indifferent music through the pipes. In the doorway mirror, my face looked like my mother's, a detail I always notice when I am frightened. The half moon, under the eyes, the determined set of the mouth. Could it be a mistake? I asked gentler. Someone with a similar haircut, a coat like hers? She looked right at me, Mom. His voice strained. She didn't say anything, but she looked. The water went off upstairs with a metallic shudder. Silence gathered itself large as a coat you aren't sure is yours to put on. I stood, the phone still in my hand, and stared at the ceiling as if it might answer. It did not. Down the hall, the old grandfather clock cleared his throat and chimed the quarter hour, surprised to be in the middle of a mystery. Adrian said my name again, softer this time, and I realized I'd pressed my fingers white around the receiver. "All right," I said. "All right." My voice steadied the way a table does when you palm its wobbling leg. "Call me when you land." "I will." We said goodbye. I hung up and listened to the house breathe. A door opened overhead. Sabrina's voice floated down casual as sun. Was that for me? No. Just a friend I called back, and it felt like stepping on a patch of ice you hope will hold. The bathroom fan thrummed, then went quiet. Floorboards spoke the soft, familiar cadence of someone dressing a drawer closing a wicker basket's light scuff across a closet shelf. I busied my hands at the sink. The kitchen window reflected me and the river in equal measure. Sabrina descended in a sage-green blouse I didn't recognize, damp hair twisted and clipped. The wicker market basket hung in the crook of her elbow, within it, a folded towel and a small purse. She looked fresh, unhurried, even amused. Do you need anything from Lippet Market? I'm thinking oranges and fennel if the fennel looks friendly. Tomatoes, I said, because tomatoes were what we were always out of. My throat had gone dry. And bread, if you like. She stepped close and kissed my cheek. Her skin was cool from the shower. A trace of rosemary shampoo brushed my nose. Back soon, she said, and the latch-loosened door bade her goodbye with its usual click. Through the window I watched her cross the front walk, skirt neat posture, straight as ordinary as the morning she moved through. I sat. The chair took me like a low wave catching a tired swimmer. When you're a mother, there is a particular kind of disbelief that does not announce itself as panic exactly, but as an argument with the air. Surely, not surely, I misunderstood. I tried to make a neat bundle of the facts, the water, the voice, the step on the stairs, the jet bridge, the passport, my son's eyes registering someone he knows as well as I do. If a person is careful, she can place her doubt on a high shelf and go about her day. I am careful, but I have lived long enough to know when the shelf might not hold. To argue with unease, I did what I always do, tidied. I realigned the salt and pepper mills. I wiped a small coffee ring from the table that no one else would have noticed. When I opened the bread box, it was already empty, and I laughed at myself, a mild, disbelieving sound. Outside, a delivery truck sighed to a stop. Theo's crayon drawing 3 wind-bent trees, and a red kite was still magneted to the refrigerator. I traced one of the tree trunks with my fingertip and remembered how he'd asked last week if I could sing his bedtime song the way his mother did, exactly the way, not my way. Children have the truest metronomes for change. I rubbed my thumb on a faint smear of graphite near the light switch and thought of Michael, of the way he sometimes leaves for work with the geometry of a problem still in his eyes. If anything could steady this house, it would be simple, verifiable things, times, objects, dates. You cannot argue with a clock even if your heart wants to. I pulled a thin ledger notebook from the drawer beside the stove. The cover is stamped with a small gold crest. Peter used to keep our property tax receipts in it. There are pages left roomy and ruled. I wrote the date, then the hour from the grandfather clock, then a line I did not yet understand but needed to see on paper. 8:15 a.m. Sabrina says she's going to Lippet Market. Sage blouse, wicker basket, hair damp, mood light. My hand looked steadier on the page than it felt. I turned the pen in my fingers. Over years of PTA sign-ins and permission slips and holiday lists, I have learned that writing can be a net and a measuring tape. You can catch what happened, and you can learn how large it is. I added one more line, not because I doubted my son, but because I did not wish to doubt my house. Phone call from Adrian reports, seeing Sabrina board flight to Madrid. Passport confirmed by agent. I closed the notebook and tucked it under the edge of the breadboard for no reason except that the gesture made me feel less adrift. In the hall, wind touched the stained glass in the front door and scattered pale colors along the floor like a handful of candies. I boiled water for tea I did not want. The kettle complained as it always does when it approaches the boil, then let out its whistle. Steam rose, ribboning the window glass. I went to switch the radio back on and stopped because the chair on the far side of the table was not at the angle I'd left it. Perhaps Theo had tugged it earlier. Perhaps I'd misremembered. The mind can be an unhelpful neighbor calling from the porch with imperfect instructions. I carried my tea to the table and held it without drinking. Sabrina would come back with fennel or good news about oranges or both. She would set the basket down and joke that she'd been conquered by the price of eggs. We would take a chicken out of the freezer for dinner. Michael would text at noon that he'd be late. I would answer with a thumbs up I'd learned to send from Theo, my first and most patient technology tutor. The day would keep itself. Instead of believing my stories about the day I touched the notebook again, just to feel the grit of its cover, I put the pen beside it like a promise to myself. The clock in the next room cleared its throat again and offered the half hour. I did not argue with it. The kettle's after-hiss thinned into ordinary quiet. I left the cup cooling and set the notebook on the counter where the morning light could find it. The page looked steadier than I felt. A house like mine carries the memory of every breakfast and quarrel and lullaby. It also carries disguises. If I couldn't trust breath and bone, I would trust ink. By 10, the light slanted cleaner across the sink. I wiped the rim of my teacup and made myself move through the rooms the way a nurse moves through a ward, observing, not interpreting. Sabrina's jacket lay across the back of the dining chair, a wool herringbone she wore when the wind ran down from the river. Her keys were not in the blue bowl by the door. A faint wet crescent darkened the bath mat upstairs, where a heel must have rested. None of it contradicted anything. None of it settled anything. At 11, the latch worked again. Sabrina's steps crossed the hall with their familiar, unhurried rhythm. She came into the kitchen smiling, a baguette, tucked like a baton against her ribs, the market basket a little heavier with fennel fronds breathing from its brim. Her blouse was no longer sage. It was powder blue, a crisp cotton with pinstripes I would have sworn I'd never seen. "The oranges sulked," she said, setting the bread beside my cooling tea, but the fennel made up for them. I nodded, and for a beat forgot how to manage my face. "Did it rain?" "No." She tilted her head, surprised by the question. "Your blouse," I said, and immediately wished I hadn't. "People hear more than we mean." "Oh, Theo's juice splashed on the green one yesterday," she said easily. "I tossed it in the wash and pulled this from the back of the closet." She shrugged. "You know how closets are." She kissed my head in passing and hummed something tuneless as she fetched plates. I wrote 1103 returns with bread fennel, powder blue blouse, says green in wash, weather dry. My hand wanted to add a verdict. The page allowed only the fact. That evening, Michael came home with the particular weariness that sits between the shoulder blades and makes even a good man shorter. He kissed the top of my head in the hall, then lowered his messenger bag as if it were filled with wet sand. "They changed the setback requirements midweek," he said. "The foundation drawings are now jazz." He smiled at his own complaint without quite meaning to and rinsed his hands while Sabrina set dinner, the sort of simple meal she is good at. Roasted carrots, a pan of lemony chicken. "I stopped by Marta's bakery on Ives," she said, laying the baguette on the board. "They've started scoring the loaves with wheat stalks. It's pretty." Michael glanced at his plate. "Thought you were going to Lippet today. First Lippet, then Ives, then home," she said. "I like to walk a loop." She reached for the carving knife with her left hand, and then when the handle refused the natural fit, shifted to her right as if remembering something she owed her body. The switch was so small I might have missed it. I did not write while she could see me. After dinner, I rinsed the plates and dried them and then tucked the moment into the ledger. Used left hand first for knife, shifted to right. Theo's hair was damp from the bath when Sabrina's soft voice ushered him to the table with a spoon. Under the kitchen light, his eyes did their bright, independent work, tracking the steam, finding his father's smile. "Can we have a story?" he asked. "The one about the crane that was lonely." Sabrina smoothed his hair. "Tonight it's Grandma's turn. I need to send a message to Ms. Billings about the field trip. The message can wait." Theo said his certainty as pure as sugar. He leaned into her side, confident in a permission he assumed would come. "Tomorrow night," she said lightly. It wasn't a refusal so much as a pivot. I sang him a version of the old song he loved, the notes tucked into the narrow stairwell as he climbed. He listened over his shoulder and corrected me when I misplaced a word. In the small pauses children allow us, I put away the bread and brushed crumbs into my palm with the quiet attention of a person tying a knot she does not want to announce. That night, I slept like a woman guarding a door. Twice, I got up to drink water I didn't want. Just before 5, someone on the street laughed in a way that made my heart race, before my mind remembered it had permission to slow again. When the clock chimed 6, I rose and made coffee and turned to the ledger the way a person might turn to prayer. Thursday, 7 to 10 a.m., Sabrina packed Theo's lunch. Notes: used left hand to butter bread. Signature on permission slip unusually rounded. Mood bright, hummed snatch of tune I don't know. 12:40 p.m., returned from errands in cream cardigan, left in gray. Said spilled coffee, though I did not find a stain. 4:15 p.m., knock at back door. Mrs. Kavanaugh, returned borrowed tin. Remarked Sabrina, chatted a blue streak yesterday about Theo's spelling test, but glided past me this morning like a skater who didn't want a collision. I thanked her and wrote her exact words. 6:30 p.m., made pasta. Reached for cast iron with a folded towel, grasped handle with left, and then moved to right. Theo spilled a pencil. Sabrina said cooler than usual, "Be more careful." Theo's mouth pulled small. Ordinary days make their own weather. Friday, the sky turned clear as glass. Saturday collapsed into an untidy snow of small obligations. The ledger absorbed them all without argument, the navy sweater she had not worn since December. The way my name looked in her writing on a sticky note. Ellie pick up at 3 with the ease open like little shelves instead of the small closed loops I'd come to expect, the wicker basket, once light under my palm and later oddly heavier for a similar outing. On Sunday afternoon, Sabrina unrolled the linen runner and asked if I preferred tulips or daffodils for the table. "Tulips droop. Daffodils preen," I said, and she laughed. She was herself again, the version that stacked tea tins by height, and tucked a loose curl behind her ear with the back of her wrist. She lifted Theo onto a chair and showed him how to rinse berries and set them on paper towels so they can rest. Resting berries felt like a kind thing to say about a difficult world. I let my body relax around the idea of it. That night, when Theo climbed into my lap with his crayons and drew a house with a red roof and a window on the side where no window exists, he said, "Mama forgot the words today." The words to what my voice did not change. My song. Sometimes she sings it like a warm coat. He looked at me gravely, but today she didn't know the coat. He pressed the crayon hard and the roof brightened. I kissed the top of his head and said nothing the ledger would not allow. On Monday, Mr. Hahn, who runs the corner shop, slipped a loaf into a paper bag and said, "Your daughter-in-law thanked me yesterday for the lottery number I told her to avoid." He laughed at his own superstition and then frowned. But this morning she stared at the pastry case like she'd never seen sugar. Maybe she was worried. Maybe, I said. The ledger later took shopkeeper noticed opposite moods across 2 mornings. When the world refuses to choose a person, must choose what to notice. I chose hands. Sabrina's hands, long and capable, had always claimed space by instinct right hand for the heavy work left for steadiness. But lately an awkwardness had moved in. A jar turned counterclockwise when clockwise would do. A pen gripped as if she were borrowing someone else's fingers. On Tuesday she wrote a note for the school, "We appreciate your care." The P had a high looped stem. The R leaned so far it needed a wall. On Wednesday she signed a delivery with a signature quick and tight, the capitals clipped as if she didn't wish them to be seen. The ledger accepted both 2 scripts. If there is a rhythm to doubt, it is a waltz, 2 steps close, 1 away. I stepped away with Michael on Wednesday night as he spread plans across the dining table. Light bled through tracing paper. He spoke of joists and light wells and a client who wanted the impossible, and then would blame him for delivering it. He laughed his good laugh. Sabrina brought him a mug and rested her hand on his shoulder, and the gesture was so entirely right that the room exhaled. "Do you need me to do drop-off tomorrow?" she asked. "I've got it," he said without looking up. He leaned on the kitchen island to jot a note, and when the pen didn't catch at first, he shook it, clicked it against his palm, clicked again. Sabrina watched with a smile that had the shine of glass and then very softly went out. On Thursday morning, Sabrina left in a soft gray sweater with a small thread pulled near the cuff. She returned in a navy blouse, hair-pinned, high cheeks cool. "A splash," she said when I glanced at the sweater draped over her arm. The sweater was dry. The ledger gave me a line and no argument. When the sum of a week reached a kind of quiet saturation, a sponge you couldn't make take wanted more drop. I began leaving the ledger open. It wasn't a dramatic decision. It was a practical one. The book lay beside the breadboard. The pen lay on top. Sometimes I recorded only the time. Sometimes I wrote nothing and just touched the cover and felt steadier. The clock made its quarters and halves and wholes. Theo's shoes made their enthusiastic noise down the hall. The same gull mapped the same river curve, and yet in the mapping became different. Saturday arrived with a milky heat that lifted the smell of cut grass up from the parks. Michael got called into the office. Theo had a classmate's birthday party at noon. Sabrina came down in a pale yellow dress sprigged with white, the wicker basket swinging at her side. "I'll go early to the market," she said, "before the crowd becomes a crowd." She smiled at me as if we shared a joke we often shared. "Back by dinner." "Of course," I said, smoothing a corner of the runner that did not need smoothing. The door clicked shut behind her, that small, domesticated sound. It might have been the sound that moved my feet. I took my shawl, the light one with a snag Peter never noticed, and the notebook because habit had made it a talisman. I waited a minute, then another, and then I stepped into the street where Saturday had already hung its laundry voices, a bicycle bell, the hush of a car rolling past the curb. Sabrina's yellow slipped along the block toward Gano Street, then turned toward the market, then without hesitation slipped left into a side alley I had crossed 100 times without registering it as a choice. The alley ran between brickbacks and the edges of yards where invasive ivy had triumphed. A cat observed us with the contempt of a sovereign. I kept well behind, letting bicycles and a pair of teenagers act as accidental curtains. Sabrina's step did not change in that tight space. If anything, it became more certain. She halted at a weathered wooden door, half buried in flaking paint, and knocked in a pattern too soft for me to hear clearly. The door admitted her. It shut promptly, not rudely, with the confidence of doors that know whom they serve. I stood at the mouth of the alley and listened to the market's hum tilt around the buildings. The sun found the back of my neck and made it feel like an exposed truth. The ledger under my arm was suddenly too heavy. I counted my breaths because breath is the oldest metronome, and because numbers would not spin away. 1, 2, 3, up to 40, then back down to 10 the way I once counted with Theo when storms bullied the windows. No one came out. No one went in. A gull bowed over the gap of sky the alley permitted and was gone. I walked back the long way past shop windows propped with wire rabbits and enamel pitchers, past a boy chalking crooked hopscotch on pavement gone soft with heat. Numbers can be squares, you leap inside too. At the corner, I angled my path to the bakery and peered through the glass, the girl at the counter piping lemon curd into tart shells, the flour ghost on the floor where someone had sacked a bag too hard. The ledger impatient under my arm wanted only one more line, 12:06 p.m., yellow dress, entered side door off alley, no reappearance observed. The kitchen was cool when I stepped in a small mercy after the brightness. I put the ledger on the counter and stood a moment to let my eyes refit the room. In that pause, a knife tapped the board. Sabrina stood at the island wearing a white blouse, hair-pinned, a wedge of fennel releasing its clean anise scent under her right hand. She looked up, surprised to see me. "You were out," she said, as if it were the most ordinary question in the world. "Yes," I said. I pulled the shawl tighter across my shoulders. The clock in the other room cleared its throat and announced the quarter hour, disinterested and exact. The quarter hour faded into the air like chalk dust. Sabrina's knife kept its small practical beat against the board. "Fennel makes everything taste clean," she said, as if the morning had only produced fennel, as if the world were obedient. I poured water into the kettle for show and set the flame low, though my attention had moved elsewhere to the alley's wooden door and the way it had accepted her without fuss. I did not ask her where she'd found the white blouse. I did not ask whether the yellow dress had walked itself home by another route. I asked about salt. She slid the mill toward me. She remarked that Theo's teacher was changing the spelling test format again, and that Michael had a client who wanted windows where there could be no windows. I made a shape in the air that meant sympathy. She smiled, and the smile was competent, polite, the kind you give cashiers and distant cousins. The ledger lay on the counter where I'd left it, a quiet witness. I wrote 12:15 p.m., Sabrina in white blouse, hair pinned. At island with fennel, knife in right hand. Later, while the fennel roasted and the house readied itself for Theo's return, I added yellow dress not observed. I slept in the cautious way people sleep when something has moved in without declaring its name. In the narrow seam before dawn, I dreamed of a hallway of identical doors, each opening onto the same room, each room containing a chair, placed at a slightly different angle. When the real light arrived and sorted the dream from the night, I tied my hair back, put on my coat, slipped the ledger into my bag, and left a note on the kitchen table that said only walk. Providence had decided on a mild morning. The cat in the alley had found a patch of sun and looked offended when I stepped over its gaze. The door that had swallowed Sabrina wore the same flaking paint, the same unbothered grain. I knocked 2 quick ones slow without knowing whether I was imitating what I'd seen or writing my own pattern in the air. No answer. I tried again, letting my knuckles rest against the wood a breath longer. The hinge protested an inch. Then a chain whispered and released, and the door opened far enough for the shadow of a face to become a face. For a second I saw Sabrina. Then the second lengthened, and I saw not Sabrina, but someone the world had set to her key. A woman with the same dark eyes and the same freckle near the left ear, but her hair twisted high in a way less practiced. Her blouse faded at the elbows, a trace of flour brushed along one wrist. "Yes," she said, and the words shook at the edges, as if words were sometimes a taller step than she remembered. "I'm sorry to intrude," I said, my mouth learning itself in this new country. "My name is Eleanor. I live near the park." The ledger in my bag, made an honest weight against my hip. "You look like someone I know." Her eyes shifted toward the street behind me, then back to my face in a quick decision. She opened the door and stepped aside. "Come." The room was narrow and clean in the way rooms are when every object is allowed only one job. A cot hugged the left wall. A hot plate steamed on a crate. A chair sat at the right-hand corner of a small table, as if any second chair would be a lie. The scent in the air was disinfectant softened by tea. On the cot, a man with hollow cheeks turned and coughed, and the cough seemed to reach farther back than his throat. "I'm Isla," she said. Up close, the echo of Sabrina had less to do with features than with the way her face assembled itself to meet strangers braced ready to become whatever was needed. "I don't know you." "No," I said, "but I know your face." Her fingers found the back of the chair and stayed there as if to remind the chair and herself what its purpose was. She swallowed. "She pays me sometimes," she said. "There are errands. A child. Only when she asks." The words came like stones skipped with a pause between each. The ledger's spine pressed against the inside of my bag as if it too wanted to be formally involved. "Who is she?" Isla looked at the cot, then at the kettle on the crate, then at my hands. "Sabrina," she said, not as a question. "You're Sabrina." I sat. The chair did its best with me. The shrug that lifted one shoulder was not careless. It was a motion practiced to keep tears from undoing more than they were owed. Because she can, Isla said. Because she needs a day or an evening or a few hours. Because she told me it wouldn't hurt anyone. She watched her own words as if to see whether they could hold their shape. She gives me cash. I buy medicine and rent we are late on. I cook when she says to cook. I am kind to the boy. I am always kind. The man on the cot coughed again and turned his face to the wall. Isla moved to him with a cup, steadied his hand, waited while he drank. Set the cup down, smoothed the blanket with a touch that knew blankets. How did she find you? I asked. She didn't, Isla said. I found her. Or I found her face. It was outside St. Bridget's clinic 3 winters ago. My mother had a bad spell and I was sitting on the bench to keep our place in line. A woman walked by and I thought the glass in the clinic window had turned to mirror. That was Sabrina. She said the name without affection or bitterness. It was a description of a weather system. I could feel my pulse in my wrists. Did she explain anything? She said she was helping me, Isla said. That's what she said first. Then later she said she was helping herself. She said we were both fortunate. I thought she let the thought rest unused between us. Your mother, I said, is she? Not my blood, Isla said, and the correction was practical, not cruel. She is my mother because she said yes when someone else said no. Isla opened a drawer in the crate and pulled out an envelope softened by many openings. She set the envelope on the table and pushed it toward me with restless fingers. She was a nurse in the old Kimball ward. A girl delivered twins. The father was gone. The grandmother said the family would take the stronger baby. The other one should be left. My mother is not good at leaving people. The envelope opened like a mouth that had repeated this story before. Inside lay a sheaf of photocopies browned at their edges, a hospital. Little bracelet slip, a discharge card, a Polaroid, with 2 shadows bent toward a bundle. On the card, female infant 5 subs, 2 pugoses. Date, time, a number that looked in the right light like a page number for the beginning of a book. I matched the date to the one I had memorized from the drawer where Sabrina kept the family documents the afternoon we filled out Theo's school forms and needed an exactness beyond rumor. The same, the breath I let go, would have been a sob if I had handed it to anyone else to name. She didn't tell you? She told me to come into the house sometimes, Isla said, to bring the basket and to know where the sugar lives. She told me the boy likes his sandwich cut into squares, not triangles. She told me your name. Her mouth softened. Ellie. I nodded that yes, some names are invitations. When she needed longer, Isla continued. She said to say, I had a headache and go upstairs early. When she needed less, she said to talk about oranges and fennel. She always says fennel. Your son works late. It makes gaps in the day and night. She knows how to step between them. How do you come and go, I asked, because the ledger would need a line and because my house had been worrying that question in the dark. The keys, the door. She gives me a key, Isla said. Not always the same one. Sometimes she takes it back and gives me another. She says she changes the locks because she is careful. The word careful wobbled. I don't like being careful like that, but I like paying the landlord and telling the clinic we can come back. I touched the edge of one paper not to keep it, but as if to assure it that it had done its job. Where does she go when you are there? Isla's eyes moved sideways toward the alley's mouth, as if the air might produce the answer, so she would not have to. I am not asked to follow, she said. Once I thought I should. I stood outside a cafe and watched her with a man. He touched her wrist as if there were already a bracelet there. They spoke like 2 people who had run out of other languages. He said his name into his phone when he stepped away. Julian Harrow. The name arrived inside the room with the calm of a person taking the seat that was always meant for him. It had the right number of syllables to fit the hole in the story. I looked at the papers again and then at Isla, who had tucked her hands under her elbows as if to keep them from apologizing for the world. I need to ask you for help, I said. The request surprised me by being smaller than the interior of my need. I will not ask you to lie. She shook her head before I finished the second sentence. I don't like lying, she said, and there was a stubbornness in it that made me see for a moment the girl she would have been if the world had poured itself with more gentleness. But I will ask my mother to sit with my father for a few hours. I can come when you say to come. I don't know what speaking will cost, but not speaking is already expensive. I put my hand on the table. She put hers near mine but did not touch it. We had both learned we could not afford to mistake gratitude for salvation. I wrote my address on the back of an old appointment card I found in my purse. The pen felt heavier than it should. This evening, I said. When I let myself back into the house, the clock confessed the hour and the stove exhaled its remembered fennel into the kitchen. I moved through the rooms lightly as if to spare the floor from a secret it must soon carry. In the hall mirror, I recognized the face of a woman who had not yet decided how to name her anger. I made the bed not because it needed making, but because order sometimes feels like shelter. Then I dialed Adrian. He answered on the second ring, his voice a row of open windows. You all right? I'm asking you for a favor. I gave him a precise list, and the list did not contain questions. He listened as he had when he was 10 and thought I held the map to every place he could ever be lost. I can do better than a favor, he said. I can bring crew manifests and the portion of the e-passport to log I'm allowed to print. I won't break rules. I'll show the rules. Thank you, Mom, he said, and the single word landed its hand on my shoulder the way his father used to when I chopped onions to say, I see you doing an ordinary thing in an extraordinary world. By late afternoon, the table was set in a way that made the table braver. I ironed a cloth and pulled out the good silver not because ritual enforces truth, but because ritual requires people to sit. Michael arrived first, eyes grainy with fatigue, tie-loosened shoulders set to a story I had not asked him to tell. He kissed my cheek. You've outdone yourself, he said as if dinner were the point. Sabrina followed with the market basket and a pale blue dress the exact color of a certain section of the river on a windless day. She kissed Michael and touched the back of his neck, and the gesture was real in the way real gestures always are learned by long practice and chosen again. Theo tumbled in from the yard, mud on his knees, a daisy in his hand that he set at my place as if the table had been missing a single note. I put the daisy in a juice glass, and the glass forgave the difference between itself and a vase. The doorbell rang. Theo ran and then remembered he was meant to be civilized and walked. Adrian stepped in wearing his gray jacket with the brass wings. The jacket made his shoulders look broader than they are. Behind him stood Isla in a clean gray dress, hair pulled back, hands folded as if to keep them safe. Theo stopped. He looked at Sabrina and then at Isla and then at me with the sudden certainty of a child whose understanding of the world has grown by a necessary inch. There's two, he said, and the sentence did not tremble. Sabrina's body pulled itself taller. For a beat, surprise looked honest on her face. Then something closed behind her eyes. What is this? She said to me, the words brittle and gleaming and meant to cut. I poured water into the glasses. It was a foolish motion, but it asked us all to remain human. We're going to talk, I said. We will be polite while we talk. Adrian set a folder on the tablecloth, the kind of folder people use when they want paper to stand up straight. Before anyone says anyone is cruel, he said, as if he had rehearsed the sentence on the walk-in. From the curb, these are facts I can share without inviting the airline or a judge to take my badge. He slid 2 printed sheets toward the end of the table where Sabrina stood not sitting. Passenger list for Flight 383 to Madrid. A seat assignment in first. A timestamp for boarding at the gate. The agent read your full name when the chip scanned. I heard her. The cameras will show it if someone asks. I do not think we're going to need the cameras. Sabrina did not look down. So your mother has found a stranger with my face, she said with a laugh so thin it barely counted as sound, and your brother has printed a piece of paper, and now we are accusing me of what exactly? Borrowing a life, I said, hiring it by the hour. Isla lifted her chin. She had not once tried to defend herself with tears. You gave me money, she said, voice even. You gave me notes about where the sugar lives. You told me to play blocks and to sing if the boy asked. You said to use the right hand in the kitchen, but sometimes the left outside, because you didn't want me to be too exact and frighten anyone. She swallowed. You told me to say I had a headache if I needed to go to bed before anyone looked too closely. Stop, Sabrina said sharply, but it was a command too late to find its obedience. Michael had not sat. The color had left his face in the slow way it leaves the sky, reluctant but thorough. Sabrina, he said, and he did not try to make his voice kinder than it was. Is any of this true? Sabrina's gaze flickered to him and then to the daisy in the juice glass as if it offended her. I am not a child, she said. I am not a houseplant to be watered and rotated. I am more than a list of lunches and piano recitals. No one said you weren't. Michael answered, and the quiet in his voice was the quiet of a long road. Then hear me, Sabrina said, and she looked at each of us as if to assort us by our usefulness. When I married you, I thought the life would be. She tipped her hand as if the rest of the sentence were invisible but heavy. I met someone who reminds me I am not just a mother and a wife. He is a person who remembers to look up when he walks. He knows people. He opens rooms for me that have light. She smiled a flash that might have once been wonder. Julian Harrow. The name fit the room the way a foot fits a shoe purchased in the right size. Michael shut his eyes. Theo had drifted toward me, his shoulder pressed into my hip, and I rested a hand on his hair because hands must do something when love is being handled badly. You could have said you needed more, Michael said, opening his eyes. You could have said you were unhappy. He was not pleading. He was setting out a geometry problem and finding that the angles would not add up. You don't listen when I do, Sabrina said, and there was a truth in it. All marriages have their ration of failures to hear. She turned to Isla as if she had forgotten until then that Isla was a person, not an arrangement. I didn't use you, she said. Isla's mouth moved the tiniest amount like a person tasting a lemon seed. You did, she said not cruelly. And I let you. Enough, I said, because the table needed someone to set blue to all this red. I lifted the folder, slid out one more item, a copy of a boarding confirmation with a barcode blurred in compliance, a seat map with 2A bright, a timestamp that refused to lie. I placed it in the empty place at the table as if someone invisible might be hungry for proof. There is a way to go forward from here. It begins with not pretending that nothing happened at all. Sabrina looked at the paper finally. Her jaw gathered itself like a fist. I won't be cross-examined in my own house, she said. It isn't your house, Michael said, and he sounded stunned to hear himself say it, as if the sentence had been waiting in his mouth for months, and had at last been given its cue. Sabrina's eyes went to Theo and skated off him, then to me and hardened, then to Isla and softened for a fraction that would not survive the telling. Keep your ledger, she said to me. Bind it in leather, read it to your friends. I am finished being studied. She reached for her purse, which had always been exactly where she left it, and for a moment she stood without moving the purse in her hand. The table laid the daisy. Being a daisy, as if there were a second world ghosting this one in which she could sit. Make a joke about fennel past the bread and be forgiven without the work. Forgiveness needs. She did not sit. The door she left through did not slam. It closed with the neat click that had accompanied so many afternoons, a small sound that in the new quiet felt as loud as a verdict. Adrian reached across the table and closed his folder. Isla's hands had found each other and held on. Michael remained standing, his breath the only clock that interested me. Theo pressed his face into my side, and I leaned down far enough to put my cheek on his crown. The daisy's stem bent toward the glass and held. The click of the door hung a moment and then dissolved into the ordinary breath of the house. Michael sat at last, as if the chair had only now earned the right to hold him. He pressed his palms flat against the tablecloth and then lifted them again, leaving 2 pale ovals in the weave. No one spoke. The daisy leaned toward his juice glass. The kettle on the stove forgot it had ever boiled. Adrian cleared the dishes, not because there was hunger left to tend, but because the movement steadied him. Isla stood where she was until her hands understood they could unclasp. Theo's cheek warmed my skirt through the fabric. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red in the way of children who have learned that crying will not return what has been taken. "Grandma," he said quietly, "can I sit in your lap while the grown-ups talk?" I reached for him, and his weight settled the room. The talking itself turned out to be a series of short, exact sentences. Michael's voice had the grain of someone reading measurements from a plan. He would arrange counsel. He would file in the morning. He would request primary custody, and the house would remain where it had always been. Adrian offered to drive him to the courthouse. He set his hand on Michael's shoulder and did not remove it until he felt the muscles confess how tired they were. Isla asked, "Do you need me to go?" And when I said no, she stayed quiet as a lamp. The days that followed did not come with symbols on them. They were simply days. The petition went in. The court date came quickly because no one disputed much. Sabrina answered by mail a packet that looked like an apology from a distance and like paperwork up close. In her affidavit, she wrote that her living arrangements had changed and that she did not wish to contest custody. She didn't use the word surrender. She didn't need to. Her name sat on the lines where names sit when they are finished being 2 things at once. On the morning he signed the last page, Michael came home with a curve missing from his mouth. He took the pen from the counter and replaced it with unnecessary care in the blue bowl by the door. He stood a long while in the hall looking at the coat rack as if it might offer an alternate ending. Theo slid into the space beneath his arm like a pencil into a sleeve. "Do I still have 2 bedrooms at home?" he asked. Michael looked at him and managed a smile that did not wobble. "You have the same windows you had yesterday," he said. Theo nodded at that. Children negotiate with what they can see. Isla appeared in our days as if the calendar had always had room for her. She came by with soup whose steam smelled of star anise and lemons. She folded laundry with the precise patience of someone who has been hired to make order and has chosen to make care instead. When Theo woke from bad dreams, Isla sat at the edge of his bed and pressed the heel of her hand between his shoulder blades until his breathing evened. She never reached for a place that hadn't made room for her. She never asked for what had not been offered. She did not bring the alley with her. She brought tea and a way of listening that let silence be less cruel. "Can you be my mom now?" Theo asked her one afternoon. A dinosaur in one hand, a crayon in the other. The dinosaur already blue around the claws. He said it the way he might have asked for a glass of water, something obvious the day had omitted. Isla's face moved as if an old seam had decided to hold. She knelt until their eyes met and said, "I can love you every day," which is not a title, but is what titles are meant to mean. Theo nodded and resumed coloring the dinosaur with the relieved focus of someone whose request has been understood. I wrote less in the ledger. Not because the habit had deserted me, but because the house no longer needed a witness every hour. When I did write, the lines were small and domestic. Theo's laugh returned to the higher register. Michael slept 6 hours without getting up. Isla remembered the tune to the bedtime song. Once out of an impulse I did not interrogate, I turned back to the first pages, to the entries built of fennel and blue blouses, and names spoken at gates, and I closed the book on them like pressing flowers no one will be asked to admire. Adrian started calling on his layovers even when he didn't have layovers. He sent Theo a postcard from a city whose name wouldn't fit on the line and wrote in block letters so careful they looked like the work of a draftsman. When he was in town, he took Theo to the museum and let him stand as long as he wished in front of the diorama with the crane and the river. "It isn't lonely," Theo declared, and Adrian agreed in the way uncles agree when the nephew is building a better truth. Spring unpacked itself from the river and climbed the streets. On a Saturday morning that pretended to be June, Michael asked Isla to walk with him while I kept Theo and the daisy glass on the kitchen table. They were gone longer than a loop around the park requires. When they returned, Isla's eyes were wet and unstartled, and Michael's mouth held a shape I remembered from when he was 10 and had at last solved the long division problem that had beat him 3 nights in a row. They chose the yard for the ceremony because it was already ours. The roses showed off along the fence in a way that would have embarrassed them if flowers were capable of embarrassment. Adrian came in uniform because it was what he had, and because the jacket looked like resolve. Mrs. Kavanaugh stood at the back with a tin of lemon cookies and dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief so old it had outlived its embroidery. Mr. Hahn sent a loaf scored with wheat stalks, the cuts clean and confident. I found the linen runner and ironed it until it gave in. Theo wore a small suit that made him look both solemn and delighted. He took his role as a best man seriously, holding the ring in his palm as if it were a bird he had promised not to startle. Isla's dress was the gray that remembers blue. A neighbor who had once been a music teacher played a thin, lovely melody on a violin whose varnish had aged to honey. Michael's voice when he spoke was steady the way a man's voice is when steadiness is the only gift he trusts. There were no grand speeches. There was the wind lifting the edge of the runner and setting it down again. There was the scrape of chairs. There was Theo laughing into Isla's waist when the neighbor's dog wandered into the aisle and sat sure he had been invited. There was the way Isla looked at Michael when the words finished, nothing theatrical, only a recognition that the day had decided to give them its full attention. After we ate lemon cookies and Mr. Hand's bread and the cake Mrs. Kavanaugh swore wasn't dry, Adrian poured sparkling water into short glasses and toasted the table without pronouncing anything. The sun worked long through the maples, and the shadows followed their instructions. When dusk arrived, the yard put on its cool version of itself. Theo fell asleep on the settee, one hand still holding the empty ring box as if the shape of it reassured him. Isla took a blanket from the back of the chair and tucked it around him, the movement as ordinary as lighting a lamp. Michael gathered plates the way a man does when he is learning again what hands are for. I stood in the doorway and watched them as a person watches a room she has repainted. The lines are the same. The light has changed. Inside, the ledger lay closed on the counter. I slid it into the drawer beside the stove and let the drawer shut without ceremony. In the hall, the clock considered the hour and chimed it unreasonably pleased to be right. The house breathed in and out. When the last glass was dried and the back door latched, the air held a quiet that stayed where it was put. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.